Are there any other questions?
Yeah, more comment. I very interested, of course, when you start talking about cameraman, you know. I think that notion is very real. It's real and it needs to be taken very seriously, you know, because that's our first point of reference. We move from there. We can only move from there. So obviously for colonial reasons, we leaped, we took a huge jump to a point that we never gave that world of photography attention, and at a very great cost, because our history in close contact is sitting there. Very early at the beginning of my photographic career, obviously you are right when you say photography is also associated with flamboyancy in terms of, I don't know, working in other spaces, but those spaces, of course, not to be undermined. They're real, there's information there. But as for some of us, when we started out, for some reason, we couldn't strongly relate with those spaces. You know, actually, I don't think as black photographers, we could relate with those spaces. It becomes more a question of working, because you don't feel yourself, you don't have any control. In most instances, you dictated to. So some of us had to choose rejection, had to reject those spaces, you know, from the dark, in the dark, not knowing what you're going to do. But the reality of a cameraman showed itself up. I'll just give an example, because at some point many years ago, when I took it for granted that one photographer is prominent, known in photographic circumstances, I had to go to his home. I didn't bother to find out where he stays. I took it for granted that he's a photographer, he's known, so he will be known. I spent over an hour looking for his house. I was well in my 30s and I had to survive, and I already had family and kids. They had to be supported on the cameraman work. It had its beauties as well, because then I felt like I was learning about photography strongly and independently, and from interactions, you know. But it was not necessarily, it is not necessarily a pleasant space, you know, and I'm not meaning to romanticize it at all, because even from within the photographic spaces, what is called a market, the colleagues can never relate with you anymore. You know, they will come up to you with consent or not come up to you, and evidently look at you, as if relate with you as an outsider. You know, so that idea of a cameraman is really is real.
I'd like to think of photography as well as a kind of an idea that through generations the kind of aesthetic of photography changes, right? The recent exhibition I saw in Cape Town was of Andrew Chawang's work and how he photographed Johannesburg. And I'd like to think about photographers that are living today and how they photograph Johannesburg. And I think both aesthetics are important, because you photograph a world that you see in the world that you live in, right? So I'd like, you know, when we're talking about photography, to also think of the ideas of time, because, you know, Andrew Chawang's work was incredible. I mean, you know, it captured the kind of heartbeat of Johannesburg. But I also think that work by other photographers like Tsidiso Munareng, or if you think of Khomotso Neto, their work as well is important in capturing Johannesburg. And I think for me, those, you know, thinking of a photographer as a timekeeper that becomes important, that it's the same Johannesburg, but somehow in the images it's slightly different because of time.
Time and what we're currently grappling with, archives, the term that's already, I mean, it's a standard term that we use for repository or storage of works of art or photography. And I think it goes back to what you mentioned earlier on around description of work that we impose titles to, is a Western work, whatnot. But I think for me the most important thing as a training institution is that sources of reference becomes quite critical because they help, you know, in the creation of new knowledge. And currently I think we're in a space whereby we're trying to understand what has been prioritized as archives, what has been published, and how relevant is it to the current in trying to find new ways of doing things, of reading, of creation of meaning, of defining, of creation of new vocabulary. Revisiting how people photograph in the past is really important. And currently the classification, for example, of structural photography, which for me I find it problematic, is that of people, you know, burning or marching or being shot at or being chased by dogs. But we never think of beautiful images of people that are smiling, that are falling in love, that are dressed up. And for me, that's one of the most important forms of resistance against oppression or suppression. And I think, I mean, in my engagement with VIP, we have embarked on this journey of trying to redefine that space, but also go back into communities and go into people's homes and find the real, I think, time keepers than those that have work being published. And I think one thing that VIP mentioned was that some of these images that were produced about protest and Zabalazo and them were used to support the system, because people identified through those processes that you're an activist, they start following you up and whatnot. So the structural photographers also need to be revisited. We need to get to understand who they are and what was their main mission within, you know, this space of documentation of struggle. But I think the most important thing for us is people's family archives, family albums that are real representation of our, you know, development in the past 40, 50 years, since the mode, the actual technology we had access to.
Are there any other? Yes, okay. Hi. Thank you, Market Photo, and Black Market for bringing us all here together. Lidudu, I want to be curious about what it is that you were saying earlier, and I think I might want to ask you to talk a bit more about your provocation at the end around. For me, it just struck me as you were talking about us being without history, in a sense. And is that what you mean? I don't know, because as Black people, if we don't have history, what do we have? So I'd like you to talk a bit more about what it is that you foresee, or how you foresee, or first describing what it is that you meant, first of all, and then how do you see us kind of going ahead from there?
Oh, amen.
Johannesburg. Just like
Hallelujah. Answer comment.
In the dark.
Yes. Yeah.
I mean, so I think my idea of that was also linked to the idea of cameraman, right? Like that we can't have this conversation about photographers without talking about cameraman, right? And also we can't have these ideas of talking about photography and only care about a colonial gaze without extending that thought further to this idea that during that time also we had cameramen, right? Like I feel like the kind of referencing of colonial photographers or colonial gaze undermines the ideas of cameramen, and I think that for me is really important to do, that we don't undermine that kind of photography. So that's the point I was getting at. That, I mean, I don't think, you know, history is not important, but I do think that what kind of history do we favor more than the other? And I think that for me, the ways I think about photography and filmmaking is that I want, and also books, I mean novels, I want to think about the first novel that I ever read before I think about other novels that were imposed to me that were not written by South Africans. I mean, one of my favorite novels is a novel called Mdluli written by Mdluli, right? And this novel changed my life. But every time I kind of, you know, attend any kind of literature festival, none of that work comes up. And I think it's important to bring that work up because that's the work that changed my life. And I think even thinking about photography, cameraman for me, a black cameraman on a bicycle, was my first interaction with photography. And when we talk about photography and not mention that cameraman for me, that is the problem.
Amen. Any other questions?
Yes, I do have a comment here. I have a problem with the terminology that was used initially in terms of like describing the timekeeper. I wish the timekeeper would have been the one description of those that take pictures. I think that affected a lot of women at the time where they felt discriminated. Hence, we don't have role models. You know, we don't have like women of your Alkumalu's generation. You know, people that we could have, my generation could have looked up to as role models. You know, they didn't want to get into that space because that space kind of like excluded them. In the, you know, if the term timekeepers would have been exercised, you know, at the time, I'm sure would have had a lot of women capturing history of the time. They just didn't identify with this tool called a camera, probably because it didn't include them, you know, and that's one of the problems. That's one of, when starting photography in the early 90s, I was curious to know if there were other black female photographers out there that have done it before me, you know, got into the space. I couldn't find any. And that's kind of, I questioned a lot of my future, like, there were some that attempted to, and they were failed by their male counterparts at the time. Is this a very intimidating space for women to try and get into? Did I choose the right career for me? You know, like questions, you know? I wasn't just dealing with challenges, it being in that space at the time as the first woman in a space that was white dominated and male dominated. But also the curiosity of like, I wish there was this mother that I could go to and ask her how she did it, and I couldn't find any. And I think maybe we should look back to the terminology that was used at the time, the cameraman. I don't want to be called a cameraman, I'm a photographer. The minute we start realizing that there is no gender button in that tool called the camera, and just call ourselves photographers, I think more women will feel comfortable in the space because there is no setting that it's a male setting and a female setting. This is just a camera, and it shouldn't be like a cameraman, shouldn't be like labeled as cameraman, camera woman, whatever. We are all photographers or we are timekeepers. I think I prefer timekeepers better.
I mean, that's interesting because I mean that's really an important point because Nikon released a new camera. And they went on this marketing thing where they chose 32 photographers across the world, and they were all men.
Yep. That's the problem. Cameraman, that term, cameraman, that's the one that made our mothers fear to be associated with.
Yeah.
So, can I?
Yes, sure.
Sorry. Can I follow on what Nell is saying? Because very much for me as someone who is interested in the photographic archive, I think what is canonized within the history of photography in South Africa is very often male, and where the question of black representation exists within that canon, it's very often also black male photographers, right? So I think then we have to move beyond the question of what should a South African photography archive look like. We should maybe perhaps consider what it doesn't include at this very moment that we're in right now, today. Like in this contemporary moment where photography is meant to be an increasingly democratized tool and medium. You know, in the digital age, with image sharing, with the degradation in the quality of what a photograph is, right? By virtue of it existing in this realm where it's remixed, retreated, reshared, re-edited, over and over. Like the question of who is included in the current conversation of how photography is being used and how we live with it and how its social impact is what drives its social impact today. How is the current conversation around photography and its potential canon in the future in this country and globally? How it potentially still continues to perpetuate the tradition of excluding particular voices and authorships. Yeah.
Are there any other questions from the floor? Right, so I'll be the timekeeper now. We're done. So I would like to thank you all for joining us. Yes. Oh wait.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Here. Let's go. Yes. Sure.
And I have one question. I want to know, in this day and age of unlearning, what's the role of a photographer? Because I have a lot of photographer friends who have lit Instagrams, but all I see is so in this process of unlearning, being a role of a photographer, because I associate them with half-naked women.
Who would like to start?
Okay, so the question is, what's the responsibility?
What's the role of
What's the role of a photographer in the process of unlearning?
I mean, it's production of new work that maybe confronts such issues. You know, I cannot define or impose on how and what people or photographers should focus on. If that's a problematic area, you know, as much as in the previous times and currently now we're still talking to you on representation and how, for example, a black body is represented, and photographers are taking a huge lead in engaging those spaces. Maybe it's about time they start doing the same. You know, they're free to do so, but I think it has to come from within. It shouldn't be imposed. So it has to come from people that know that they are in this practice for a purpose of engaging societal issues or confronting challenged practices that, like you are identifying, and for them to engage them. Maybe that's the starting point. You know, I don't know if that helps. Yeah, because I cannot say photographers go and confront this nude thing. You know, because nude means it's interpreted differently to different people. You know, there's images that are produced by photographers that are nude, but for a particular purpose. You know, we need to understand why maybe Instagram as a new space where images are presented without any form of restriction of curation. You know, we're in a free world. You know, maybe that's where new ideas will come in. Maybe we shouldn't become censors of such. You know, we will evolve, and Instagram will find a space or create a space or platform for other photographers to start engaging those issues. You know, maybe we let it be. It will come with a particular outcome. It might be more than we expect.
Yes.
If one is to
well, I don't know if it was a cameraman or a photographer. And it was during a time when my dad had, so we grew up in exile, but my dad left before us. So she commissioned this photographer to take photographs of me and my little sister. And we've since, whenever I look at that reel or film of that day, because it's a very specific day, and we were dressed up in a very particular way, you know, in our Sunday best, and because we had to look good, right? She was sending them to my dad sure how well she was taking care of us. But that for me, every time I look at that reel of photographs, and they're bits of it because it was an event, it was a day, talks about that time. And I can only remember and think about the emotions that I felt only by looking at that image.
One last thing without open there, it involves one, a new direction, two, whether I call it an accent, but something that either is going to supersede or is going to replace or is going to open up different new avenues. So the question is, what is the direction that you are going to produce or you are going to open up for possibilities? Let's suspend that, that's crazy. I have two problems here. One is this notion of never touch it on cameramen. And the respondent talked about vocabulary. That language or the notion of vocabulary is already gendered. And Zanel was brought in. It's not only gender, there's also a question of sexuality. Because gender usually refers to men and women, but now we are learning in this contemporary that there's also gay, there's lesbian, there's so forth, so forth. So it's not only a question of gender when you say cameraman. So we are excluding other sexualities, other forms of becoming human that have been suppressed historically. And we keep on using this notion, cameraman, without any sense of reflection. So what is it that Photo Workshop is going to do to address the question of language in a way in which we think, we talk, we process, we represent, and we create shift? If in this very kind of room, we are still unreflective in a language in which we choose to talk about. That's one. Two, I don't understand what you mean by timekeeper. It's so nonsensical to say photographer is a timekeeper. In what way? There are two things there. There's one time, there's a keeper. These are two words. So it means you have to talk about what we mean by time. Who's time? And two, what do you mean by keeper? Who's this keeper? In addition to that, under what circumstances are these two phenomena operating in terms of time, also in terms of keeper? So in other words, how do we complicate the condition under which we work as producers of ideas? Of course, there we are not only talking about photography, we are also talking about other modes and other forms of productions, whether they are talking about painters, whether they are talking about performers, because I don't think this session, this imbizo is restricted to photography, right? So over the course of the 2 days, we'll be talking about writing, we'll be talking about music, we're talking about DJs, we're going to be talking about performers and so forth. So why tonight are we restricting this conversation to photography? Thank you.